This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour, and welcome to Unique Scotland, the podcast from my website, exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. I'm recording this on the 1st of January 2021, so firstly, a very happy new year to all of my listeners. I wish you good health and happiness, and a COVID-free new year. Today the weather is super with clear blue skies, little wind, and only a few ripples on the shore of a very calm Clyde estuary, but with a temperature of 1 degree centigrade or 34 degrees Fahrenheit, it is bitterly cold. And the overnight frost has not melted, which leaves a beautiful crisp white landscape. In my last podcast, I took you from Inverness to Dornoch, and that is where we're starting today. We're going to continue our travels on the North Coast 500, a route that will take us along a 516 mile or 830 kilometre scenic route around the north of Scotland, starting and ending at Inverness Castle. As I mentioned before, I'm particularly excited in producing this podcast as I will be returning to my family roots. That's Mackay country, and I'm delighted to be doing this for a number of fellow Mackays who have asked specifically for a podcast on this area. Well, as we leave our hotel, which is the Dornoch Castle Hotel, we'll travel northeast on the A9, and that hugs the coast with the North Sea on our right-hand side. Now we'll be passing through Helmsdale and have a look at the emigrant statue, which is a reminder of the dark days of the Highland Clearances. Dunbeath, a beautiful little fishing village, with a connection to a senior royal death in suspicious circumstances. And the mystery that surrounds that royal is that he was King George's controversial younger brother, but more of that later. We'll visit Leicester and go on to Wick, and stay the night near Wick in a fabulous Victorian mansion. As always, it's great to share Scotland with you, and hopefully this will whet your appetite to come and visit this fine country for yourselves, when you're able, of course. For the time being, as well as podcasts, I'm conducting virtual live tours, so join me in my car around Scotland, and my website has the details, www.exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. The good news at the start of this year is that we finally have a working vaccine, and hopefully a personal visit for some of you will be possible in the not too distant future. Until that time arrives, please do enjoy these podcasts and meander around Scotland with me from the comfort of your own armchair. Actually, some listen while cycling, walking their dogs, jogging, and even some in the bath. Well, wherever you are, I would now like you to relax and be transported to Scotland on this second part of our Unique Scotland journey around the North Coast 500. It's going to be a blast. After a super evening and a hearty breakfast at the Dornoch Hotel, we get back on the road. We're on the A9 heading north once more and cross another body of water called Loch Fleet on a part of the road known as the Mound. And in fact, the mound was made from earth that was brought from either side of the road to effectively build a causeway. As we cross the causeway, if you look down to your left, you can see another old bridge, and it's interesting to stop here for a few moments just to look at how the old bridge was constructed, and by one of my engineering heroes, Thomas Telford of the Caledonian Canal fame. As well as bridges, he built harbours and churches, but this bridge shows how ingenious this man was. It's called a stagecoach bridge, but this is a bridge with a difference. It has a series of sluice gates to prevent seawater getting upstream into the Mound aldergrove swamps. Effectively, the pent-up waters of Loch Fleet are drained by an impressive series of sluice gates. Each arch of the stone-built bridge is fitted with a wooden, non-returnable flap valve, which prevents seawater from flowing upriver while allowing fresh water to drain away. A system of chains and pulleys operate the sluices, with the winding gear housed in small stone huts either side of the bridge. In fact, salmon are often seen in the pool below the bridge, just waiting for the sluice gates to open up to allow them upstream. I mean, you just wouldn't know it was there, of course, unless I told you, so do stop and have a look at this engineering masterpiece. The Countess of Sutherland was the first to cross the mound on the 26th of June 1816, carriage and all. And talking of the Sutherlands, just as we cross the mound, we can see at the top of the hill called Ben Braggy a huge monument to the first Duke of Sutherland. The Mannie is the local name for the Sutherland monument, rising above the next town we'll be visiting, Golspie. The 100-foot statue is in commemoration of the first Duke of Sutherland and overlooks his most famous castle, Dunrobin. The first Duke was notorious for his role in the clearances of his tenants in the early 19th century, and my own Mackay family from Strathnaver suffered at the hands of his factor, the infamous Patrick Seller. Recently, some campaigners have called for the monument to be removed, but most, including myself, feel it should remain as a memorial to the cruelty of the clearances. Now, the clearances will be a separate podcast, so I won't dwell on them here. I have to say, though, if you have a spare couple of hours, the walk to the top of Ben Braggy will get some good Highland air into your lungs and reward you with a magnificent sight of the mountains to the west and the North Sea to the east. It's just fabulous. We soon enter the town of Golspie, which has a population of just over 1,500 people. Originally a small fishing hamlet, Golspie was, like many villages on the East Sutherland coast, expanded in the early 19th century to house some of those evicted from the inland straths and glens during the clearances. Effectively, strath is a wide valley and glen is a narrow valley. Fishing became the main industry, but the opening of the railway in 1868 brought the first tourists to the area. Today, Golspie is an attractive little seaside resort with a long sandy beach, and there's a number of scenic walks around the area, including one at the Big Burn with its spectacular waterfalls. There's a number of historic buildings too, including St Andrew's Church, dating from the 16th century, and most famously Dunrobin Castle. This is one of the grandest houses in the north of Scotland and is situated just north of the village. The village has a swimming pool, kart track, a braid-designed golf course, tennis courts, as well as an abundance of nature and wildlife on its doorstep, in the form of Loch Fleet Nature Reserve that we've just passed over on the mound. It's clear that the village dates back to prehistoric times with several brochs visible. Now, a broch is a stone-built roundhouse of about 2,000 years old, and I'm going to be talking more about brochs later on. But, as I said, the village, like so many in this part of the world, grew up on the back of the clearances that I'll be discussing later. But, in simple terms, this was just the time when the glens and straths of the Highlands of Scotland were cleared of tenants to make way for sheep. Coastal towns like Golspie were turned into small fishing villages to give those previous farmers from the cleared villages an occupation in fishing. It's just a pity that so many of them drowned. If only it had been so simple, but the method of clearing was rather barbaric, with families removed from their homes at short notice and their homes demolished in front of them. And this issue remains contentious, even today. As we start to head out of the village, we drive past the Golspie Inn, and that reminds me of one of the local stories about the clearances. I've just finished reading James Hunter's excellent book called Set Adrift Upon the World, The Sutherland Clearances. As I drive past the old inn, which was built in 1808, I'm reminded of events recalled in the book in 1813 when a local man, John Bannerman, was arrested in Golspie Inn by law officers who had agreed to meet him to receive a letter of grievance on behalf of the Kildonan residents who were about to be removed from their homes to make way for sheep. Kildonan is a valley not far from Golspie, which we'll be passing shortly. Now, Sheriff Robert McKidd, less interested in the petition, wanted names of all those who contributed to the letter, and when Bannerman refused to give him the information, he was arrested, much to the fury of the Kildonan residents. McKidd then ordered certain rabble-rousers, as he called them, to report to the Golspie Inn for discussions. The men named in the petitions, realising that they too would be imprisoned, gained huge support from other settlements, and a huge crowd descended upon Golspie Inn at the appointed time. It was an angry crowd who had come to release John Bannerman, and eventually McKidd and Patrick Seller, who played a pretty awful part in the clearances, made a hasty retreat to Dunrobin Castle. If you listen to my podcast on Inverness to the Gairloch, I mentioned Patrick Sellar on the tour of Inverness, not for his fame, but for his infamy. Anyway, as we leave the Golspie Inn behind, the place where Sellar and McKidd fled to Dunrobin Castle is exactly where we are heading now. And it only takes about 5 minutes to get to the entrance of the castle, and as we turn into the driveway, we pass between two imposing towers acting as gate sentries to the driveway down to the castle. There's a magnificent tree-lined avenue for about a quarter of a mile, then the avenue opens up into a large car park with the rear of the castle facing us. And what a breathtaking sight. It is huge. There's a tall square stone tower on the left of some 6 stories. To the right of that is another attached building of 4 stories, and to the right of that is another smaller square tower with a deep blue clock face staring out at us. To the right of this tower are other buildings attached, making the size of this castle quite extraordinary. Dunrobin Castle is the most northerly of Scotland's great houses, and the largest in the Northern Highlands, with 189 rooms. I mean, you got to ask yourself, who on earth needs 189 rooms? Dunrobin Castle is also one of the oldest continuously inhabited houses, dating back to the early 1300s, and it's home to the Earls and later the Dukes of Sutherland. As we approach the entrance in the large tower on the left-hand side, we can see beyond the castle the wonderful view that it has, sitting high up on a cliff edge and towering over the exquisite gardens and the deep blue North Sea beyond. Indeed, the best view of the castle is from the front. It resembles a magnificent French chateau with its towering conical spires, and its imposing presence on the cliff edge sends a message about the power of those within, and those were Clan Sutherland. The Earldom of Sutherland was created in 1235, and the first Duke was created in 1833, and that Duke was George Granville Levenson Gower. He was the richest man in Britain, which probably says something for the splendour of Dunrobin. A castle has stood on this site since the 13th century, possibly on the site of an early medieval fort. The name Dunrobin means Robin's Hill or Fort in Gaelic, and may have come from Robert, the 6th Earl of Sutherland, who died in 1427. The early castle was actually a fortified square tower or keep, with walls 6 feet thick and a vaulted ceiling looking out from a cliff-top position. The keep stood isolated for some 200 years, until a staircase and a high house were added. Normally in the 16th and 17th century, when the nobility decided to upgrade their old fortified towers or keeps, they tended to have them demolished for a more modern construction. Well, I'm delighted to say that in Dunrobin's case, the old keep was encased by a series of additions from the 16th century onwards, and thus survives in the centre of this castle. And it's easy to tell, because when you enter that part of the castle, you see the huge 6 feet thick walls and window openings. In 1785, a large extension was constructed, and over many years other additions to the castle were made, making Dunrobin one of the largest and most splendid castles and private residences in Scotland. It was Sir Charles Barry, the architect, who completely remodelled the castle in the 1850s to change it from a fort to a house in the Scottish baronial style that had become popular among the aristocracy, especially those who were inspired by Queen Victoria's new residence at Balmoral. There's very much a French influence, with conical spires to the whole project, including the gardens based on Versailles. The interior is spectacular, and I really just can't do it justice in a few lines here. You can, however, look up Dunrobin online for a virtual tour and see the splendour of the furniture and furnishings within. And do please have a look on my website to see photos of this extraordinarily beautiful castle. Very much a place to visit when you're heading in this direction, and I would say do not miss it, whatever you do. To add to the enjoyment of the visit, there's a falconry display. Falconry is the ancient art of hunting with birds of prey, and was originally developed as a means of hunting fast or difficult prey as food for the table. The castle has its own falconer in the grounds, and he keeps golden eagles and peregrine falcons, both resident birds of the Scottish Highlands, of course, and he has additional attractions which include more exotic species such as the European eagle owl. There's just so much to see and do at Dunrobin that it's difficult to leave, but we must, and when we do get back on the road, we head north for about 5 miles to a small village called Brora. The name Brora is derived from ancient Norse, meaning river with a bridge, and sure enough, there's a bridge in the middle of the village crossing the river Brora. Brora is a small post-industrial village, having at one time a coal pit, boat building, salt pans, curing fish, wool mill and a stone quarry, as well as a distillery. And not far from Brora is the Clynelish distillery, which I'm sure some of you whisky drinkers will have heard of. Stone from the quarry was used in the construction of London Bridge, Liverpool Cathedral and Dunrobin Castle. And Brora was the first place in the north of Scotland to have electricity thanks to its wool industry. Such a small place and yet so much connection with the past. And one of the reasons I love to come here is for the fabulous sandy beach. Oh, and Brora Golf Links, which runs the whole length of the beach. Brora Golf Club was established in 1891 and recently celebrated its 125th anniversary. And in 1923, James Braid, 5 times Open champion, was invited to submit plans for a redesigned 18-hole layout. Well, this was largely implemented as he suggested, and remains mostly unchanged to this day. Now, I was up in Brora about 3 weeks ago and played the course. It's a super links course, and as it runs right alongside the beach, has wonderful views to enjoy as you chase your golf ball over the sand dunes. Well, I certainly did, having not hit too many fairways. And if you're a non-golfer, that simply means the cut grass part of the course that you're meant to follow rather than zigzagging around the edges of the sand dunes. Well, we leave Brora, still hugging the coast and the North Sea on the right-hand side, and about 15 minutes later we arrive in the small town of Helmsdale. Now, I've mentioned the Kildonan settlement when I talked about the Golspie Inn. Well, if you turned left at Helmsdale, you'd be travelling up the A897 and into the Strath of Kildonan, where these poor folk, trying to avoid eviction, lived. It's a small village with less than 1,000 inhabitants. The modern village was actually planned in 1814 to resettle communities that had been removed from the surrounding straths as part of, yes, you've guessed it, the Highland Clearances. And this is a common theme as we wind our way around the coast to the north. Just as we enter the village, which is a scattered set of stone-built houses and cottages that run from a gentle hill sloping all the way down to the sea, there are 6 tall flagpoles on our left-hand side, and behind the flagpoles is an amazing statue of a man, a woman holding a baby, and a child, all seemingly straining to see where they are heading. So we stopped to look at this, and it's actually called the Emigrant Statue and was unveiled on the 23rd of July 2007. The statue is the work of sculptor Gerald Lang. It depicts 4 figures. The kilted man is looking ahead, out to sea, into an unknown future, while beside him a boy is looking up to him for guidance or reassurance. The woman, wrapped in a shawl, is holding a baby and is looking back towards the home they've been forced to leave. In September 2008, a matching statue known as the Selkirk Settlers Monument was unveiled in Winnipeg in Canada. On this statue, there's an inscription on the monument in Gaelic and English, and it reads as follows: "The Emigrants commemorates the people of the Highlands and Islands of Scotland who, in the face of great adversity, sought freedom, hope and justice beyond these shores. They and their descendants went forth and explored continents, built great countries and cities, and gave their enterprise and culture to the world. This is their legacy. Their voices will echo forever through the empty straths and glens of their homeland." And this is really quite a poignant moment and time for reflection. In reality, the emigrant statue provides a focus for the commemoration of the huge numbers of people evicted from their ancestral homes during the Highland Clearances. And many of those displaced by the clearances found their way to new homes elsewhere in Scotland or very often abroad, where they made new lives. Thus the reason for the flagpoles with the flags of Scotland, the USA, Canada, Australia and New Zealand, and also the flag of the United Nations. And some of you listening to this may know or may have ancestral links to this time in Scottish history, and please do drop me a line to let me know your story. If your ancestors were those early settlers, then I'd love to recount your story on a future podcast, with your permission, of course. This statue really does evoke very mixed feelings produced by this complex story of the clearances, and its place here in Helmsdale is very fitting. Just beyond the flagpoles we cross the River Helmsdale on a relatively new bridge, and we're leaving the county of Sutherland and entering the county of Caithness. If we look down to our left into the small Helmsdale harbour, we can see the old bridge, which was designed by no other than the great man himself, Thomas Telford. It's a sturdy, stone-built, two-archway bridge which is used today as a footbridge. And as we look at the bridge, we can see on the left-hand side an impressive clock tower. It's actually made from grey granite ashlar above a hammer-dressed base, designed as a landmark for the Helmsdale fishing fleet. It's buttressed at the corners, and the clock faces are white with Roman numerals. But it's not just an ordinary clock tower. It is in fact a war memorial to the Helmsdale men lost in both the First and the Second World War, and it's very impressive. Helmsdale is a good stopping off point for a coffee and a visit to the local museum, or as it's called, the Time Span Museum. It's fascinating, and I always see something different when I visit. It opened in 1987 and tells the local and social history of the parish and people, taking you on a journey from the sea and the river mouth, upstream and inland to the Strath of Kildonan. It covers the boom and bust of the herring fishing industry, the dark historic period of change of the Highland Clearances, the brief but feverish 1869 gold rush, the shameful burning of the last witch in Sutherland. I was also fascinated to see a painting of the last wolf in Sutherland which was shot in the 1700s. They are of course extinct in UK now and have been for many years. But if you're in this area and you have any connection with the past, then one of the staff in the Time Span Museum is very happy to help you dig into the archives to find what you are looking for. Well, we continue north along the A9, and I do enjoy this journey with clear roads, the sea to our right and the rolling heather-covered hills to our left. And if you roll down the window, you get such a fresh smell of both the sea air and the scented heather, a fresh breeze that's part of what makes Scotland great. We're heading towards Dunbeath, some 12 miles from Helmsdale, and we pass through a few settlements on the way, such as Ousdale, Berrydale and Borg, and they all have their own stories to tell. I've decided to stop for a short while near Ousdale, because nearby there is the Ousdale Broch, effectively the ruins of an Iron Age dry stone tower. You can park on the left-hand side of the road, but be careful as you cross the road to join a gravel path to the Broch, because it can be busy occasionally. There are some good interpretation signs showing that as well as being the North Coast 500 route, you're also joining the John O'Groats Trail, which is a walking route from Inverness to John O'Groats. These brochs are believed to be the defensive dwelling houses. They generally had a single entrance with bar holes, door checks and lintels. They were built in stone, and the outer and inner wall skins were separate but tied together with linking stone slabs. There's a spiral staircase winding upwards between the inner and outer walls, and each wall would have been about 2 to 3 feet thick. There would have been timber-framed lean-to dwellings lining the inner face of the wall. Brochs vary from 20 to 50 feet high. They were roofed, perhaps with a conical timber frame roof covered with a locally sourced thatch, and the best preserved broch in Scotland is Musa in Shetland, whose walls exceed 21 feet in height. The Ousdale Broch stands on a narrow terrace at the foot of a long shallow slope. The terrace is bounded to the east by a deep ravine containing the Ousdale Burn being a small stream, which runs into the sea to the southeast, and on the south by a shallower ravine with a native birch woodland adjacent to the site. Ousdale Broch is over 2,000 years old and is something you just have to visit if you get the chance. It's actually quite difficult getting one's head around the mastery of construction of this building by our Iron Age ancestors. Ousdale Broch has a solid base and an external diameter of around 40 feet or 16 metres, with some walls still reaching over 10 feet or 3 metres in height. A ditch probably surrounded the structure, and there are some indications of outbuildings. However, a human skeleton was discovered buried face down by the entrance to the stairs during an excavation in 1891. Now, these skeletal remains were dated to the post-medieval period, but with the remains now lost, any reassessment of their age cannot be undertaken. It is believed that the individual perhaps represents a deviant burial, and that's one given to those excluded from society. Intrigued? Well, I certainly am, and I've written a note to myself to dive into the archaeological notes just a little bit more. The area surrounding the Broch is rich in both prehistoric and historical archaeological remains, and these continue up the coast as we travel north. I won't go into detail about local battles, but there is one that I should mention, and that's the Battle of Ousdale in 1201 between William the Lion, King of Scotland, and Norse Jarl Harald the Elder, ruler of Caithness and Orkney. Before you leave the site, and if you have time, you might want to walk about 500 yards to the north of the Broch, where you can find the remains of a post-medieval clearance village of the late 1700s. The ruins of traditional longhouses and enclosures are still visible. Our next stop is Dunbeath, but about 2 miles from the town, keep an eye out on the right-hand side for the towers of Dunbeath Castle. The crenellated round towers with the saltire flag of Scotland flying can just be seen through the trees and remind us of the defensive structures that would have dominated this coast. Earliest records show that there was a castle here in the 15th century, although the present building is of mainly 17th century origin, with 19th century extensions. It's super and sits on a cliff top overlooking the sea. Indeed, you would really have to be on a ship to get the best view of it, with its fabulous grounds, which are included in the inventory of gardens and designed landscapes in Scotland. The castle was Clan Sinclair, and it was a Clan Sinclair stronghold for about 350 years, but in 1967 it was sold to a private buyer and remains a private residence today. 2 miles later, and we arrive at the lovely small sleepy village of Dunbeath. The village was built to cash in on the herring boom in the early 1800s, with up to 100 boats operating from the harbour here, which is a bit strange considering that the harbour is actually tiny. Anyway, times have changed and the herring boom is long gone. The harbour is much less active now, though it does provide an excellent viewpoint for Dunbeath Castle, which is perched precariously on the cliffs to the south. On the harbour side is an attractive statue depicting Ken and the salmon, which celebrates the life of novelist Neil Gunn. Now, Ken and the salmon were characters of one of his books, and the beautiful bronze statue depicts a small boy struggling to carry a salmon as big as himself on his back. Neil was born in Dunbeath in 1891 and died in 1973. He was a famous Scottish author of many books, including The Silver Darlings, which was a nickname for the herringfish that brought wealth to this part of the world in the early 19th century. Many of his books reflect Dunbeath, and he wrote some lovely lines on the village itself, of which I'm going to read a very small part. These small straths, like the Strath of Dunbeath, have this intimate beauty. In boyhood, we get to know every square yard of it. We encompass it physically, and our memories hold it. Birches, hazel trees for nutting, pools with trout, and an occasionally visible salmon. River flats with the wind on the bracken, and disappearing rabbit scuts. A wealth of wildflower and small bird life. The soaring hawk, the unexpected roe, the ancient graveyard. Thoughts of the folk who once lived far inland in straths and hollows. The past and the present held in a moment of daydream. That was from his book, My Bit of Britain, 1941. Well, as we leave the village and look to our left, 3 miles inland from Dunbeath is Eagle Rock, the site of a little-known monument to an air crash that killed Prince George, the Duke of Kent, who died when his short Sunderland flying boat crashed on a Dunbeath hillside on the 25th of August 1942. The Sunderland flying boat ran into a mountainside as it headed from Invergordon to Iceland, where the Duke was due to inspect forces. One of the mysteries, of course, is the Sunderland flying boat should have continued following the coast and not be inland, as it was when it crashed. Now, George was the younger brother of George VI, who was on the throne after his elder brother Edward VII abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson, and you all know that story. The crash was described as a tragic accident at the time, but was it? I discovered a newspaper, the North Wales News, and the headline it shows, "Scandal of Royal Death." Now, I've passed this way many times, and I've always believed it was a tragic accident, but I know the rumour that the government may have had something to do with the crash due to the Duke's reckless behaviour. Well, this other story took me by surprise when I did some deeper research, and the article starts with the following. A North Wales woman believes she holds the key to the death of controversial Prince George, Duke of Kent. At the time, the official inquiry blamed the crash on the aircraft's pilot, Flight Lieutenant Frank Guyon, but Margaret Harris of Prestatyn, Wales, has told how her uncle, Flight Sergeant Andrew Jack, hid a secret for nearly 60 years, that it was actually the Duke at the control of the aircraft. Flight Sergeant Jack was allegedly ordered by the RAF not to reveal any details concerning the accident in order to protect the reputation of the Duke. Jack, who was at the back of the plane, had survived the accident because the rear section of the aircraft had broken off immediately after the crash, and the rest of the plane burst into flames. Jack, who was Margaret Harris's uncle, dragged everyone from the blazing wreckage, suffering terrible burns as he fought to save them, and told his family that it was the Duke who was at the controls, not Flight Lieutenant Guyon, the man who eventually was blamed. And Sergeant Jack only broke his silence after 60 years, as he was told to say nothing by the authorities. Margaret Harris said that her uncle knew the pilot was not to blame, yet could say nothing, especially to the family of Flight Lieutenant Guyon, who were led to believe that he had been to blame for the Duke's death. As for Flight Sergeant Jack, who was badly burned, he wouldn't have sustained any injuries had he not tried to save the other passengers, and as a result of his actions, he had to undergo plastic surgery on several occasions to improve the condition of his face and hands. One part of this mystery which remains concerns the identity of an extra passenger on the plane. There were 16 on board instead of the scheduled 15, so who was this mysterious person? It's been suggested that it was the boyfriend of the Duke, who was known to be bisexual. We'll probably never know. Privately, the Duke was addicted to cocaine and morphine and carried on a number of reckless and indiscreet affairs with men and women. One of his more famous rumoured liaisons was with the noted playwright Noel Coward. Well, there's certainly more to it than meets the eye, but we may have to wait a little longer until future historians obtain archived files and disclose the truth. Well, it just shows what you can unearth by a little bit of research. I have to say that whatever the circumstances of the crash, the story has touched me. When I pass through Dunbeath in the future, I will certainly always pay my respects to those killed, but especially to Flight Lieutenant Guyon, who died on duty that fateful day. As we continue north, and not far from Dunbeath, is the Laidhay Croft Museum, recreating the experience of a crofting life now largely gone. A few miles further north, near Latheron, is the Clan Gun Heritage Centre and Museum, housed in a converted church. It's a really lovely place to visit. And the last time I visited, in 2017, was with guests John and Meredith Green and Dawn and Adele Gill. And I'll be visiting again on my next trip north because a couple of months ago I discovered that one of my Mackay grandmother ancestors, dating back to the 1700s, had married the son of the chief of Clan Gun. Now, I realised the Mackays were close to Clan Gun, but I hadn't realised how close they were to my own branch. It's really good to know that I have a clan chieftain's blood running through my veins, but don't worry, it won't change me. Our next stop north is the small town of Leibster, which, like many of the ports along the coastline, was once a big herring fishing port. There's a small museum, the Waterlines. It's a heritage museum, and it's located at the harbour. The village itself was founded in 1802 as a planned village by the local landowner General Patrick Sinclair, and his sons continued with its development. Well, by about 1859, some 357 boats operated from the harbour, making it the third busiest fishing port in Scotland, only exceeded by Wick and Fraserburgh. In the museum, there's some fascinating photographs, large numbers of fishing boats alongside, sometimes 5 to 10 deep. But it's the activity ashore that's photographed that I find just as interesting, with large numbers of mainly women who were gutting the herrings and salting them into vast quantities of oak barrels to be transported to the markets at home and overseas as well. Now, you'll recall from our visit to Dunbeath that the famous Scottish author Neil Gunn wrote a book called The Silver Darlings. Well, it was turned into a film, and that was actually shot on location in Leibster. As it happens, in 2019, Leibster was also used as a location for shooting the Netflix drama The Crown. Well, as we continue on, there's a signpost just north of Leibster that says Wick 12 miles. However, this evening we're not going as far as Wick, as we're going to stop in the small hamlet of Thrumster, and bed down for the evening at Thrumster House, a fabulous Victorian property set in 20 acres of gardens and woodlands. It's a former laird's house, and there's actually an Iron Age Broch structure in the grounds. Well, as well as the warm welcome from our hosts as we arrive, there are 2 friendly dogs who greet us like old friends. It's been a great day, and I can't wait to sit by the fireplace in the grand entrance hall beneath a galleried landing before dinner and then take a walk around the grounds and the surrounding woodland. Well, that's it for another week, and thank you once more to the comments from listeners and for your supportive emails. I know that there's a few of my previous guests who will recognise some of the sites that I talk about on our Mackay clan tours, and also of course my gun connections. Well, I do hope you're looking forward to another look at Mackay country. I'm delighted to let you know that I have started my live interactive tours by Zoom using Eventbrite virtual tours. My first one is a tour of the Trossachs on Wednesday 27th of January. Only a couple of weeks away, guys. I'm doing one every night at 7 p.m. GMT, but if you'd like me to do one, for example, 7 p.m. Eastern Pacific Time, then let me know. I'd be delighted to programme one in. In these tours, you're going to see Scotland from the comfort of your living room. The live tour consists of you and me in my car, together making a trip through the Trossachs. With my car-mounted camera and drone footage, I will be talking to you as we drive along, as if you were with me in the car. And you can chat, and we can ask questions as well. There's tales of a 16th century church minister who died in mysterious circumstances on a fairy hill. You'll see the mountains overlooking Loch Lomond, and we'll see the famous Loch Catherine where the steamer, the Sir Walter Scott, still sails. We'll virtually climb a couple of mountains, and the scenery is breathtaking, and there's lots more. So join me on my virtual tour and go to my website www.exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk and click on the link on the first page. There is a small charge which amounts to about 3 cups of Starbucks coffee, and that helps to cover the cost of video and drone footage. So do get signed up, and get signed up soon because spaces are limited. Well, I do hope that you've enjoyed this week's podcast as much as I've enjoyed bringing it to you. Any comments are always welcome, and drop me a line using the contact page on my Exclusive Scottish Visits website. I always like to hear how and where you listen to the podcast, for example. Well, in the next podcast, we're going to go on to Wick, and that has one of the best Thomas Telford harbours in the northeast. It's not a large town with about 7,000 to 8,000 people, but that's the largest conurbation in this part of Scotland. From there we'll go on to John O'Groats, which lies on Great Britain's northeastern tip and is popular with tourists as one end of the longest distance between 2 inhabited points on the British mainland, with Land's End in Cornwall lying 876 miles southwest. We'll also go on to visit the Castle of May, and that was the late Queen Mother's home, and then pass through Thurso before calling into the Mackay Museum at Betty Hill. We'll then go on to see the ruined Mackay Castle at Tongue, and I will be right at home. The north coast is beautifully rugged, with fabulous sandy beaches and spectacular views to the far north, with the Orkney Islands often visible on a clear day. It's going to be great. Well, sadly COVID continues to persist, but there is a light at the end of the tunnel. So, stay safe, stay positive, and get that vaccine. My very best wishes to you all, wherever you are in the world, and I raise a glass in the traditional Scottish fashion, Slanjava.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.